Thank you. As many of you know, I have been talking about racism a lot in these past couple of months, both in sermons that I've preached and in some of the reflections in the newsletter, even in individual conversations with some of you. And there's a reason for that. We, as a congregation, a little over a year ago, committed not just to being non-racist, not just to avoiding explicit acts of discrimination ourselves, but to being actively anti-racist, to looking for the very roots of racism within us, within our broader society, and working to uproot them so that we can dismantle racism. And this has been leading up to a conversation that we're going to be having after church today about one possible way that we might do this, through something called a racism audit, which the leaders of our congregation have proposed we do through an organization called Wider Stand. Now, I want to be clear that in preaching these sermons and writing these reflections, I have not been trying to push for a particular outcome in these discussions or in the vote that will take place next week. I do believe that as Christians, we have a duty to engage racism as one of the evil spiritual powers and principalities of our time. But I think it's fair for us to ask whether this particular audit is the best way to do it. I'm going to leave that for us to discuss after church today. Instead, what I've been hoping to do is to provide some biblical and theological tools to help us think about racism. And there's one tool in particular that I think is very relevant and very helpful. So I wanted to offer it before our conversations began today, and that is Ruth, really the entire book of Ruth. Now, Ruth is very useful when thinking about how we might respond constructively and hopefully to racism, but I want to make a point that I said before, which I know is a bit confusing, and that's that the book of Ruth never addresses racism directly, nor does any other book in the Bible, because racism as we know it today did not exist in biblical times. It's a bit confusing to hear us say that because it sure seems like there has been a lot of discrimination from as far back as we know in world history. You can think of the way that the Egyptians mistreated the Jews early on, or the Jews at times mistreated other peoples in their history. And no doubt this has been true. And it's often been based on ethnic identity. If you are not from our ethnic group or tribe, then we are going to mistreat you. But since we're starting to get into kind of a more sophisticated discussion, I'll go ahead and share that the term for this is actually xenophobia. It's related to racism, but there are a few key ways that racism goes beyond xenophobia. It builds upon it and moves from there. And I want to just highlight some of those for the sake of our discussion later today. I think first, although it is certainly common and natural for peoples all around the world to prefer peoples from their own society and culture and to be a little more distrustful toward peoples outside of their culture, this is something that Europeans started doing too. But once it became racism, they used this newly emerging field of science to claim not just that they preferred their own people, but that they were objectively better, that it could be proven by some universal standard. Now, this is bogus. It's been completely debunked. In fact, there aren't even races in the way that the Europeans divided them up in the early modern era. Nevertheless, Europeans were influential in shaping the entire world during a time when science was on a rise, during the moment when they were the dominant force in world history. And they were able to create structures and stereotypes that have been extremely persistent and that still live with us today. So this is something that is far beyond the scale of anything that people experience with xenophobia in biblical times. And there's one more distinction that I'd like to make between racism and xenophobia, and that's that modern racism is extraordinarily simplistic. It's just very basic. It suggests that you can simply look at a person and tell from their skin primarily what race they belong to and where they fall on this supposed hierarchy. And that wasn't the case in the same way in the ancient world. Yes, people recognized that people from different societies and culture had different skin tones in general, but they also knew that two people could come from the same biological family and have different hues of skin. You couldn't just look at a person and immediately figure them out in the ancient world, in the way that racism has created this false and yet extraordinarily powerful judgmental system in our world today. So I think it's important for us to be able to keep some of those differences in mind, but this is not because xenophobia is unimportant. No, racism had its origins in xenophobia, and that just natural human tendency to distrust someone who doesn't look like us or talk like us or behave in the way that we do in our everyday lives. And we find that this is true. We find this phenomenon of xenophobia throughout the Bible. We can find it from Genesis to Revelation. Now, it's not consistent throughout the Bible. There are periods of time of internationalism, when people seem to be getting along with others from other cultures in trade, sometimes in marriage, sometimes with Jews even giving other peoples high positions of responsibility and trust, or vice versa. But then there are also times where xenophobia just really takes off. And it's very common for this to occur during times of crisis and political turmoil in particular. Perhaps most intensely in all of the Bible during the period of the Judges. You might recall, for those of you who were here when we were doing our study of the story of the Bible, that we discussed the book of Judges. And Judges is a time when there was no central authority in Israel. Everybody was kind of doing what was right in their own eyes. And there was chaos. There was extreme distrust and extreme xenophobia. We find a deeply disturbing example of this in Judges chapter 12, when Jephthah, who was the leader of the tribes of Gilead, which you can see here on the map, got in conflict with the tribe of Ephraim, which you can also see here in the picture. And this is kind of how and so in this conflict, they were so heated that they started building a kind of wall, a kind of border or barrier, and had this violent posture toward each other. Let's listen to the way that the Bible actually describes it in our text. It says, the Gileadites captured the fords of Jordan leading to Ephraim, and whenever a survivor of Ephraim said, "Come, let me cross over," the men of Gilead asked him, "Are you an Ephraimite?" If he said no, they said, "All right, say Shibboleth." If he said Sibboleth, because he could not pronounce the word correctly, they seized him and killed him at the fords of the Jordan. 42,000 Ephraimites were killed at that time. So you can see several things in this passage. First, that that the Gileadites are so paranoid that they're building a wall, they're fortifying it with armed people, and they're willing to kill anyone just because they don't have the right ethnic identity. It's also noteworthy that they couldn't tell immediately by looking at someone whether they were a Gileadite or an Ephraimite. And so they used this litmus test of asking them to say a word that was difficult to pronounce for people who came from Ephraim. And unfortunately, as has often been the case, a person's accent was used during this time as a basis for discrimination, and in this case, deadly discrimination. So it was an extremely difficult time in which to live. Now, the reason that we say all this, that we're setting all this up, and I'm sorry, I lost my spot here, is because because in the book of Ruth, the entire context is set during this chaotic time in Judges, right? Ruth, chapter 1, the very opening verse says this. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went for a while to live in the country of Moab. Now, just that first line, in the days when the judges ruled, is already trying to tip us off that, look, this is happening during this xenophobic, distrustful time. But it actually goes beyond that. Because if we go back to the map that we were discussing before, and we think about where this takes place, Naomi's family, as you can see here, is from Jerusalem, which is located around here. I'm a little bit off in my circling there, but I'm sorry, their family is not from Jerusalem, but from Bethlehem here on this map. And when they're there in Bethlehem, if there was a famine in the land and you were a person from Bethlehem and you were going to head east in order to find relief, where would you be the most likely to go? Well, you would think it would be here in the tribes east of the Jordan, in the land of Gilead. It was both geographically closer and culturally closer to them. But remember, things were so bad now between the people east of the Jordan and the people west of the Jordan that they couldn't even go to their fellow Jews for help. Instead, they went down to a foreign country, to Moab. Right? So this is all kind of setting the stage for just what a hostile, xenophobic time that we're living in. But once Naomi's family reaches the land of Moab, it seems that they're treated fairly well. We don't know necessarily that every single Moabite that they encountered loved them, but we do know that they were able to live there in peace. They were able to build a home there in which they dwelled for at least 10 years. And there were at least a couple of families that were so welcoming and hospitable that they were willing to enter in marriage relationships with them. And Ruth was one of the products of these marriage relationships. Ruth, in fact, was herself the symbol of kind of Moabite hospitality. She as well as Orpah. But then, of course, something tragic happens. Naomi's husband dies, and then after that, her 2 sons die, and she's left in a position where she is extremely vulnerable as a woman with no male companions in the ancient Near East. Back in that time, of course, women did not have the same kind of rights or access or opportunities that men have. And so without having any kind of male relative through which she could live, she was extraordinarily vulnerable. So, of course, she tells her 2 daughters-in-law, like, look, I care about you, but I can't provide for you anymore. You're probably best to go back to your own families. You're young enough. You can probably get remarried. You'll be okay. And neither of the daughter-in-laws want to do this. They built such a strong bond with them. But of the 2, Ruth is the one who stays. And it's at this point in the story when Ruth makes the most famous statement that she has in the entire book. And that's, of course, Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. And this is admirable. It's not just a statement of affection. It's not just that Ruth just has developed such a strong bond with Naomi that she's sticking with her. She's being a lifeline for Naomi here. Because Naomi, as a woman past childbearing age, really has no financial prospects or connections. But if Ruth sticks with her and Ruth is able to get remarried, then Naomi would become a part of that household as well. And so Ruth is sacrificing her own security, her own background, her own cultural safety net out of her care for Naomi in an extreme act of hospitality. So then we hear that Ruth and Naomi cross over into Israel. Now, once they're in Israel, despite the fact that this is set in the time of Judges, despite the fact that we have several hints in the story that xenophobia is lurking in the background, we don't see any overt acts of discrimination. But we can still see plenty of signs that the xenophobia is still there in the background, right? And so we see it, for example, in the extreme caution and humility that Ruth uses in the way that she approaches these Israelites, in the way that she talks to them. So, for example, when she first interacts with Boaz, this is how she does it. This is what she says. She bowed with her face to the ground and she asked him, "Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" Right? Like she's describing herself as kind of this unworthy, undeserving person, when really she shouldn't have to do that. She has a family relationship to Boaz. She is Naomi's daughter-in-law, right? They have this connection. She's there because she had done this heroic act of hospitality. But you can tell from the way that Naomi and Ruth are interacting through this entire story that they have to be extraordinarily careful. They can't come in and make demands. They have to take this posture of being these kind of humble foreigners, and they don't want to upset anyone or say the wrong things. Now, there's other ways in which we can see xenophobia in the background in the story. Another key one is in the way in which Ruth is identified in the story, right? And we hear this especially in the way that one of Boaz's servants, his overseer, talks about Ruth, right? So when Boaz asks, what's going on, what's Ruth, the overseer replies, she's the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi. That's true. There's nothing false in that statement. But notice he really zones in on her ethnic identity. Who is Ruth fundamentally? This faithful woman who has cared about Naomi, this hospitable stranger, this person of great character. No, she is seen first and foremost as a Moabite. And with that identity always going ahead of her, that's the challenge that she has to face, is that she's seen first and foremost as a foreigner. And then there's one more thing I want to point out when we're thinking about ways in which xenophobia shows up in the background of the story. And that is that the hospitality that Boaz's people show to Ruth isn't really hospitality at all. It's simply a matter of not harming them, right? Listen to the way that the text describes it here. The overseer goes on to say, she's a Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi. She said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters." She came into the field and has remained here from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter. In other words, she kind of came and tagged along, and we let her do it. We didn't get in her way. And apparently this was the great noble act of not harming somebody in this era of xenophobia. It's also worth noting that even this isn't as generous as it might sound, because there's actually a law in the book of Deuteronomy that commands that they have to do this, that this is how the Israelites ought to behave. You can see from Deuteronomy chapter 24, when you reap your harvest in your field and forget a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back to get it. It shall be left for the foreigner, the orphan, and the widow, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all your undertakings. So are Boaz's people being cruel or xenophobic? Well, I guess not explicitly, but they're really doing the bare minimum of what God expected them to do in the way that they interacted with other people. But the story of Ruth really turns on Boaz's response, because Boaz doesn't just do this bare minimum, he responds appropriately, right? First thing that we might note is that Boaz actively integrates Ruth into the community. It's not like the overseer where he just says, all right, you can kind of tag along, you can gather the sheaves that you want. No, he finds a way to make sure that she is included as a member of the actual community of Israelites. Listen to the way that he describes it in his response. So first he goes directly to Ruth. That is significant in and of itself. And Boaz said to Ruth, my daughter, listen to me. Don't go glean in another field and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. He's introducing him to the other women. He's including him. And then he goes on and adds a series of extra benefits and protections that he wants to offer her because he sees her as a member of the community. Now, related to this is the fact that Boaz, unlike the overseer, does not see her primarily as a foreigner. Instead, he knows her story. Right? And Ruth is actually surprised by this. We can go back and see the same question that Ruth said before. When Boaz starts talking to her, at this she bowed with her face to the ground, and she asked him, why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner? But Boaz rejects this construct, right? This isn't a matter of charity where he, as this nice person, is just treating her charitably because she's a person in need. Instead, he says this. And he says, I've been told all about what you've done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and homeland and came to live with the people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. So certainly there's still this kind of offering refuge and offering protection that's happening because Boaz is in the position of power, but he's not doing it because he sees it as an act of generosity. He's doing it because he knows her story, because he doesn't just see her as a foreigner, but as a person who has made a courageous act to enter into their community. And he's doing it instead as a matter of justice. And I think this is an important thing for us to keep in mind. When we, in our day and age, are thinking about how we want to interact with other people, we're not doing this out of some kind of pity, because we feel sorry for people, because we want to be generous or feel good about ourselves. The more that you actually learn about people's stories, about the story of the United States and how we got to this place as a country, the more essential it becomes that we treat people with dignity as a matter of justice. And I think it's also a point to note that although, yes, Boaz is admirable for this, we can consider him righteous. He's certainly a person that we can look to as a role model. It's not like the point of the book of Ruth is to focus on what a great person Boaz is. No, you see, when he does this, when they enter into a just relationship, it proves to be a mutually beneficial experience. Because apparently, as the story goes on, we learn that Boaz was a little bit older. And for whatever reason, he was not married, like some of the younger men. Maybe he had been married and he had a spouse who died before he was able to give birth, before she gave birth to any children. We don't know a whole lot about what his background is. But he was surprised when later in the story, Ruth approaches him and expresses that she is interested in him. And he expresses it like this: "This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor." He finds that because she is now a member of this community and he sees her as one and he treats her as one, they are able to form a healthy relationship as a couple. And that gives him something that he wouldn't have had the opportunity to have before: a partner of integrity, a partner with whom he found a bond. It blesses both he and Ruth. And I think it's important to keep this in mind when we are thinking about the work that we are doing as a church. Ultimately, the point of justice work is not to beat ourselves up. It's not because we are repenting just for something that we've done in the past, but because we have a desire to get to a place of flourishing. If we are able to be a space where we can truly root out any barriers that might exist between white people and people of color, or even further barriers beyond just that superficial basic one, then it creates the opportunity for all of us to flourish. We all benefit when we are not just going by the bare minimum, but treating each other with the dignity that we really and fully deserve. And finally, there's just one more thing that I want to point out from this story, and that it's that even though this is primarily an internal interaction that we have between Boaz and Ruth, everybody benefits from it. It's not just them, but it spills over into the community. Listen to this passage toward the end of the book. "So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. When he made love to her, the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. Then Naomi took the child in her arms and cared for him. The women living there said, 'Naomi has a son,' and they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David." Now, this is significant for a lot of reasons. Of course, it immediately has a benefit for Naomi, and it immediately has this positive news that gets spread in the community. At a time when things are extraordinarily xenophobic, you have this light, this positive story coming out of the book of Ruth. But even more so, their marriage led to the birth of Obed, which led to the birth of Jesse, which led to the birth of David. And David was one of the key figures who helped the Israelites get out of this horrible xenophobic period of Judges and eventually be able to live at a time of more safety and stability and internationalism when everybody could flourish. Now, the truth is that Ruth and Boaz didn't see that benefit immediately. They probably didn't see it occur in their lifetimes. But the work that they were doing with each other and creating in their own household, in their own community, a place where people were truly treated with the dignity that they deserve, an effort that, by the way, required some work, some legal maneuvering, some minutia that we didn't even cover at the end of chapter 3 and the beginning of chapter 4. But when they did this work, even in this hostile time, it planted a seed that ultimately benefited everyone. There are times when I look at our society and I find myself extraordinarily discouraged. I'm discouraged at the gap that exists between the right and the left, the racial tensions that seem to be getting worse rather than better. And I don't know what to do about this larger social problem. But I do have hope that maybe in this space, in our space, in our community, we can begin to do the work of really seeing each other, really and fully seeing each other, and extending a hospitality that goes beyond the merely superficial one. And you know what? That's what it takes. Small but hard acts like this for God to plant the seeds to change the world.